Marshall, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be with you as always.
Well, as you know, November 2011 was the 10th anniversary of China joining the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. So why don't we start with a very simple question. What has joining the WTO meant for China?
The short answer is everything. The changes in China have been quite dramatic. You can see the inflections in virtually every plot of the economy that you lay out. The obvious changes, trade has gone up. As a consequence of trade, GDP has gone up. As a consequence of the concentration of trade in the coastal cities of China, especially the special economic zones, the migration of peasant workers from countryside to city and back has increased enormously. One thing that, another small inflection point, interestingly, is that the rural-urban income gap didn't decrease, but it stopped increasing rapidly about the time of WTO, I assume as the result of wages remittances to the migrant workers. So overall, this has had an enormous impact on China, probably far greater than anybody anticipated.
That leads to the next logical question is, are there some sectors in China that benefited more than others as a result of China joining the WTO? And were there actually other areas of the economy that may have suffered because of it?
Yeah, there are actually some losers in this. There are some spectacular winners. The big winner, of course, we know is manufacturing. Within manufacturing, the big winner is electronics. China's biggest export is electronic goods, computers and the like, not needle goods anymore. These industries have burgeoned. Much of the work, of course, is assembly work, like Foxconn is doing for Apple and others. But a lot of the work is manufacture of components and modules, things like power transformers, electric cords, so on and so forth. So the manufacturing sector in general, electronics in particular, has benefited. The next sector that's benefited actually is the automotive sector. Huge quantities of automotive components are coming out of China as a consequence of the development of this component infrastructure. Auto assembly has burgeoned in China. Some could argue that the center of the auto industry has moved from Detroit to Shanghai. All of this, I think, is a consequence of WTO. Where have there been fewer benefits or even negative benefits? The answer quickly is the countryside of China. The migration has depleted the countryside of many working-age people. We talked a moment ago about the movie The Last Train Home. The couple, the protagonists in the movie, they leave their children with the grandparents behind in Sichuan province as they migrate to Shenzhen. I also think that Chinese agriculture is in a bind as a consequence of WTO. China's had a number of experiments with land reform. The first in '78 under Deng Xiaoping was pretty successful. The household responsibility system, they got productivity up. China's not had a great starvation since. They're very worried about that given the experience in the '60s. Today, however, they're still struggling with further land reform. There were some initiatives 2002, 2008 to give the peasants control over their land, but they've not really succeeded in assembling large enough plots of land to produce efficiently, even given the low labor cost. So, for example, two crops in China are very much at risk. One of those crops, I just read the article before I came down here, is the cotton crop. They cannot find enough people to harvest the cotton. As a consequence, some of that cotton is going to stay unharvested. They'll try mechanization, but mechanization doesn't work too well because the quality of the harvest is not nearly as good. Ultimately, they'll move to mechanization, but then who knows how price competitive the crop will be. Interestingly, the tomato crop's in the same situation. This is a very delicate fruit, and still grown on very small plots with hand harvesting. And the companies that are manufacturing the tomato paste, which is the base ingredient in ketchup and other condiments, aren't doing very well. In fact, they're losing money end of last year and this year, again because of labor shortages and raw material costs going up.
And how is China coping with these disruptions in the rural area? What solutions are they putting in place?
It's really interesting because you have to go back and read what's called Central Document Number 1. For the last 4 or 5 years, until this year, until 2011, Central Document Number 1 focused on rural land reform and later rural subsidization, market adjustment they call it, trying to take a lot of initiatives to subsidize agriculture with certain key crops and to incentivize people to stay on the land. Okay. Still, however, they've not gone quite as far as India, as best I understand India, where it's Indian government policy to keep the rural population, which is the large majority of India, it's only 50% in China now, to keep the rural population on the land by guaranteeing everybody, for example, 100 hours of work a month and providing other subsidies to make rural life attractive. China's not yet done that. Interestingly, Central Document Number 1 this year has a slightly different focus, and it's a critical issue for China as well. It's called water. They were very much worried about drought in Shandong province at the beginning of the year. The rains finally came, but it was pretty bad for a while. And you know, if you look at a map of China, it turns out the most agriculturally intensive areas are in that center area of China, above Jiangsu province, below Beijing, Hubei, so forth. They were going without water for a long, long time. The Yellow River was running dry. And water will be a perennial problem for China as well. And of course, the water supply and the crops are closely related to each other.
Now, coming back to the earlier point about the way the manufacturing sector, especially electronic manufacturing, has been one of the winners. What has this meant, membership in the WTO, what has it meant for the competitiveness of Chinese firms? How have they had to transform themselves into global producers, and what can other companies in other parts of the world learn from China's experience in this respect?
Well, I think we've got to separate two parts of the Chinese economy. There's the foreign invested assembly economy. Again, Foxconn, even think of Samsung, has huge investment in China. By some measures, Samsung's the largest manufacturing firm in China. These firms have entered China, drawn on a low-cost labor supply, and a labor supply that, at least until recently, has been very, very reliable, and pursued low-cost manufacturing for export. Their competitive advantage, again, is cost. The margins are razor thin, and they're a bit at risk because the cost pressures are coming from two sides. We're still seeing some appreciation of the RMB, although if you read the recent columns in the business press, there's some questions as to whether the RMB will continue to appreciate near term. Long term, everyone's confident it will. So they pressure RMB appreciation plus wage increases. Okay, the wage increases are driven by supply and demand. So let's go back to the inflection point we talked about at the beginning. One of the interesting and I think very significant inflection points, which we didn't understand until about a year ago, was rural wages. This is called the Lewis turn, the Lewis transition, where as the economy moves toward industrialization, labor supply shrinks first in the countryside, then in the city, and wages consequently increase. Well, what did we see? We saw as early as 2003, this is only 2 years after WTO, wages in the deep interior provinces of China, like Gansu, begin to go up dramatically. Agricultural wages on the rate of 10–15% a year, sometimes more than that. Wages, harvest season, off season. The folks who acquired these data out at the Gansu Agricultural University looked at it every way, came to the conclusion that this Lewis turn occurred about in 2003, again only 2 years after WTO. Now, the migrant labor's wages began in the cities, began increasing dramatically 2005, 2006, a couple of years later. And so by 2007, wages were going up 20%. And in fact, the labor shortages provoked a new labor law in China. And the 2008 labor contract law, LCL, gave workers in principle, not in fact, but in principle on paper, some of the same rights as tenured professors. 2 3-year contracts. After that, your employment was permanent. Discharge only for cause, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite remarkable when you read this document. I'm not sure that it's honored more, in fact, in the breach, but it's a remarkable document to read. But that's a response to the labor shortages.
Right.
So 2008 was an interruption in this, a dramatic interruption. Because, as you know, WTO notwithstanding, exports virtually stopped in some industries for lack of letters of credit. The government resuscitated the economy with a massive stimulus package. Don't need to go into details of it, but it's again another turning point in China. But the assembly economy I talked about is being hit hard. RMB appreciation, their manufacturing for export, and increases in labor costs. And so parts of that economy are at risk.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a very good segue to the point I wanted to raise next, which is clearly China has grown dramatically during the past decade, after its participation in the WTO.
Yeah, it has.
Its exports were, 4% of the global economy or so 10 years ago. Now China has become the world's biggest exporter. How sustainable do you think is this growth?
Well, that follows exactly. The export economy, in my judgment, is unlikely to continue to grow at the same rate. And why is that? Again, we talked about the cost squeeze on the exporters. And of course, economic conditions in their principal markets, whether it's the EU or the US, are soft. That's a nice term. So as a consequence, their ability to sell unlimited amounts of relatively low-cost goods in these markets is going to be crimped somewhat. And there are lots of reports now of plants closing, particularly in Guangdong province. And finally, the numbers are beginning to show a slowing of exports. They didn't for a while, leading to the inference that it was the Chinese domestic economy slowing down. I think it actually is a little bit, or the rate of growth is slowing down. But it's pretty clear now that this export model is not sustainable. Now, that said, the Chinese economy has other places to grow. And here's the irony. The place to grow is in the countryside of China. And so I think, in fact, I've observed firsthand, and I'm writing about, the development of rural distribution and the sudden profusion of rural markets in China. Finally, at long last, the traditional marketing system, the traditional distribution channels in rural China are giving way to much more modern systems. And as the large firms in China begin to penetrate the countryside, which for a long time they ignored, that'll give a little further headroom to China, but not nearly as much headroom as we've seen in the last 10 years.
So do you think that the growth of the domestic market will be fast enough and deep enough to offset the shrinking of the export demand as Europe and US slow down and their consumption slows down?
I don't know, and here's why. There's yet another competing force called population. Okay, China's aging. Last year, 2010, the dependency ratio, non-working to working population, reversed. It had been going down through 2010, and beginning last year, it started going up. China has made some small modifications, but hasn't fundamentally changed the one-child policy. Even if they did, it wouldn't make any difference for 15, 20 years at least. The best projections I see suggest that China is going to have an upside-down population pyramid very, very quickly. And I sometimes describe it as a pagoda, looking very much like Japan today. The EU is not going to suffer this to the same extent. The US, provided we still have some immigration, is not going to suffer it at all. And what happens when the population ages? There's a reluctance to spend money, at least on consumer goods. And we see this actually in marketing surveys in China, that many people, though they have money, are reluctant to spend. So the question is, what steps can be taken to unleash the buying power of domestic consumers? Now, again, there's a group in the countryside, a very large group, not the wealthiest in China, but not poor, who have untapped spending power and simply haven't had access to goods, which they'll now have. But how much more spending is going to take place in the urban populations as they think about getting older, requiring Social Security support if they can get it, medical services, et cetera? I don't know. I think that's the big question mark for China.
So if you look to the next 10 years, by 2021, what other inflection points do you see coming down the pike?
That's an interesting question. There are a couple of inflection points. One's next year. The government will change. We have no idea what the policies of Xi Jinping are going to be. We simply don't know. He's been very careful. Will he be another Hu Jintao? Will he be another Zhu Rongji? Nobody knows. That's probably the most fundamental inflection point coming up soon. It will take a few years to know what direction China takes. I think continuation of the present policies will alone retard or slow or cap economic growth a bit, because under Hu Jintao, there's been a resurgence of the wealth and to some extent the power of the state enterprises in China. Fewer are employed by the state. The SOEs are responsible for less and less of overall output in GDP, but still their centrality in the economy has gone up. And the question is whether there's going to be a second and vigorous wave of privatization in China turning toward a more capitalist system. We don't know the answer to this question. And I think that's a very, very fundamental question. A second inflection point will occur if, under a lower growth scenario, different provinces go in different ways. You've perhaps read about Bo Xilai, who is the party secretary of Chongqing. He's advocating a very domestic-centric set of policies. We should produce for the people's needs here in China. Okay? There's also a little bit of Maoism associated with Mr. Bo, which people have seen in Time magazine and other places. So his policies are very inward-looking. Take care of the people. If you go down to Guangdong, which has been the export engine of China, you'll see a different scenario. The government there, I sat at an economic forum, actually keynoted an economic forum in Guangdong in June. The conversation was entirely about building and rebuilding our export industry. So the second turning point would be this kind of internal conversation, if you will, between a policy of focusing on the home market and focusing on the needs of the people versus maintaining the export machine. And how that would play out politically, I have no idea, but clearly something like that is coming along. Third inflection point, innovation. China has a set of policies designed to promote innovation. Whether they'll have the effect, no one knows yet. Among other policies, just like their targets for GDP growth, their targets for patents. The rate of patenting in China far exceeds patenting in the US. Although many of the patents are so-called service patents of short duration, many of them are not renewed because they're of no economic value. The number of patents of economic value is hard to determine, but in any case, there is a commitment to patenting, and political advancement depends on GDP, but for some officials it also depends on patenting. There's also a policy of indigenous innovation. And it's been around for a while, and the government asserts it, and then, last June or so said, well, we withdraw part of it. But basically, in government purchasing, the policy is, or was, to favor locally developed products developed not necessarily by Chinese-owned companies, but by Chinese registered business entities. They could be foreign-owned. And of course, many of the MNCs, other Western businesses, have objected to this. Exactly where the policy stands, a little unclear. As always, the rule in China is it's going to vary by province, so it's hard to tell. But that innovation inflection point, if it works as anticipated, could counteract some of the other forces I'm describing.
Right. Since we were talking a little earlier about the export market, there's also, of course, this financial aspect to it. China has been trying so hard to globalize the RMB, and I was wondering how you see that playing out over the next 10 years or so.
The RMB, that's an interesting question. First, I will confess, even on camera, that this is not my expertise. Having said that, I think they're in a bit of a bind, and here's why. By globalizing the RMB, you mean rendering the RMB convertible on the capital side, capital accounts.
That's
and that would allow bond markets to open up, so on and so forth. If you don't have convertibility, it's very hard to get global investors in there to purchase bonds.
Precisely.
Okay. Here's the rub. Look at M2 in China, the money supply. It's like a rocket. It's going up a lot faster than their GDP. You're looking at numbers in the vicinity of 20% a year. And the question is, what's the source of it, and can they reverse this at the source? And the source, ironically, in my judgment, lies in their currency policy. Why is that? When the Chinese government, when I take to the Chinese government, the People's Bank of China, $1, I'm an investor. Okay, I need RMB. Okay, they give me the RMB, although in decreasing amounts. I think we're at about 6.4 right now, something like that. They hold on to the dollar. They don't sell that dollar because they want to keep the country export competitive. So rather than selling the dollar, they hold the dollar, and the central bank reimburses the commercial bank where I exchange the money, effectively not with fresh RMB, but rather with what are called sterilization bills, long-term, low-interest notes. Okay? and the banks are required to hold them in their reserves. That's one of the reasons the reserves are so high. And the consequence of this is that on the one hand, you've got all this currency around. On the other hand, banks are finding it harder and harder to loan money because the reserve requirements go up. That's a check on inflation. If those bills do somehow circulate, I'm not confident that they don't circulate. That's a double negative. I really don't understand the intricacies of the system. I'm not sure anyone here does. Right. But if they circulate, they create inflation because there's so much money around. If they don't circulate, they crimp loans, they crimp industry. And so China's in a bit of a bind because imagine what would happen if suddenly the RMB were fully convertible. Okay, what would happen is people are going to wake up and see what we've seen anyway but aren't fully taking into account, and that is prices are very high in China. I have a slide I'm going to use tomorrow in class on food prices in China. Supermarket prices in China. Sure, rice is cheap, cabbage is cheap compared to the US. But if you look at the price of pork, not a lot different. Actually, milk, not a lot different. And Chinese incomes, at least by the official statistics, are a lot lower than ours. So there'll be a lot of unanticipated consequences of freeing up the RMB, and yet there's no alternative to it because basically the people of China are paying the price of an RMB that's pegged, at a fairly low level at this point.
So let me end with one final question. Hypothetically, let's assume that you were invited by the Chinese government to give them some advice on how they should navigate the next 10 years of participation in the WTO so as to maximize the benefit to the Chinese economy and the world economy. What advice could you give them? Oh,
it'd be unequivocal. They wouldn't listen to it, but it would be unequivocal. I mean, and that is like, if the people of China have everyone has aspiration to become middle class, right? And yet, some sense, the business model China's been using under WTO has run its course. Costs have gone up. Labor is tight. Population's aging. Okay. What's the solution to the problem? Well, the solution doesn't lie in pouring more concrete, which is what they did in response to 2008. The fixed asset investment just blew through the ceiling. No, the solution lies in the quality of your people. And as a consequence, to move up the value chain, you've got to upgrade the skills of your folks, which means a huge investment in people. So I'd stimulate the demand side by trying to provide modest social safety nets where none now exist. That's very important so that the aging population, the aging consumer class, is willing to spend a little more. But at the same time, given that there's going to be a shortage of people, that you're going to be substituting sophisticated equipment for people, you're going to have to upgrade the skills of people. Probably at all levels, including managerial. So one recommendation is they send their most promising people here to Wharton. Okay? I know, seriously. So they learn the skills that are needed to run very complex, very sophisticated enterprises. But more generally, that they try to take some of the folks whose experience is in manual labor and train them to be sophisticated technicians so that China is able to continue to grow, relying on higher value-added industries and sheds the lower value-added industries, again, like the needle trades, clothing, stuff like that. So that would be the recommendation.
Marshall, thank you so much for joining us today.
As always, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.